taking just to killing school. Class start next week. You gotta at least have 2 bodies. I'm taking just to killing school. Class.
You need at least 2 bodies because having none isn't an option. I can't function without them. Lil Jeff wasn't just talking tough in his raps, he was living everything he spoke about. He ran the streets with a ruthless attitude, setting strict rules for what some called his murder school. His music wasn't just entertainment, it was a reflection of real-life violence. In his diss tracks, he proudly bragged about the people he had taken out and mocked his fallen enemies with no remorse. His lack of guilt only made his reputation worse. People feared him, knowing he was one of the most heartless figures in the streets. He didn't just rap about violence, he treated it like a joke, laughing on Instagram about real murders as if they were nothing but funny stories. His actions proved he had no limits. At one point, he even shot 2 high school students and later made jokes about it like it was just another day in his life. His level of brutality kept escalating, and he had no plans of stopping. Lil Jeff's way of handling business was cold and calculated. If he had a problem with someone, he wouldn't hesitate to act. One of his most ruthless moves was when he shot a rival in the stomach in broad daylight, making sure everyone knew he wasn't playing around. His philosophy was simple: strike first, be brutal. He didn't believe in giving second chances. If you crossed him, you wouldn't live to regret it. He never wore a mask, never showed fear. Every move he made was a warning to the streets. If you got on his bad side, there was no escape. His presence alone was enough to send a message. He had built a name for himself as one of the most feared figures around, and he thrived on that reputation. On May 13, 2021, death was closer than anyone realized. The streets of Chicago were as busy as ever. Cars moved up and down the roads, people filled the sidewalks, and businesses carried on with their daily operations. It was just another normal day, for most people. But for Jeff Gutter, the reality was different. Ronnie L. Sis. Drunk Jr. moved through the city as if he had nothing to worry about, as if enemies didn't exist. He acted too comfortable, unaware that danger was lurking nearby. What he didn't know was that Jeff Gutter had connected him to a murder from the month before. Whether the accusation was true or not didn't matter. What mattered was that Jeff believed it, and in his world, that was all the justification he needed. As the day went on, Jeff's mind was set. He wasn't the type to let things slide. When he had a target, he made sure to follow through. The way he saw it, the streets had rules, and once you were marked, there was no escaping fate. His enemies knew this too well. Once you were in his sights, your days were numbered. Jeff wasn't one to wait for the right moment. He created the moment. He moved with confidence, knowing that fear wasn't an option. He didn't need a mask or a disguise. He wanted people to know exactly who was responsible when the job was done. His reputation thrived on these moments, on the fear, the respect, the chaos. By the time the sun started setting, the city's usual rhythm continued. People went about their routines, unaware that something deadly was about to unfold. But for those who lived by the code of the streets, the tension was always there. A simple mistake, a wrong word, or being in the wrong place at the wrong time could mean the difference between life and death. Jeff was ready. He had played this game long enough to know there was no room for hesitation. When the moment came, he executed without a second thought. No fear, no doubt, just another warning to anyone who dared to challenge him. The streets didn't pause. Life continued, but for some, the message was clear. In Jeff's world, there was only one rule: survival. And to survive, you had to be willing to do whatever it took. As the night settled over the city, the echoes of gunfire faded into the usual noise of Chicago's streets. Another name was added to the growing list of victims, another lesson was taught. And for Jeff Gutter, it was just another day living by the only code he had ever known. He watched in anticipation of the ideal time. The street erupted as people screamed, ducked, and ran. But Jeff didn't run away in panic. Instead, he just walked. Gutter had just left a store, eyes on his phone, completely unaware of the danger closing in. Jeff moved quickly, without saying anything or warning, and then the first bullet struck his chest, slipping his phone from his fingers. His body jerked as he struggled to react, but Jeff wasn't done. Gutter was already gone by the time the police arrived, disappearing into the chaos as if nothing had ever happened. People had seen everything, but in the streets, silence was the rule. Names were whispered in hushed voices, but fear kept everyone from speaking out. Witnessing a murder in broad daylight was chilling enough, but seeing it carried out so confidently sent a message loud and clear: Lil Jeff was not to be messed with. His reputation had already made people talk, but now he had taken it a step further, using his brutal actions to fuel his music. Drill music has always been known for its bold and reckless lyrics, but in March 2024, a song titled FTO was released that blurred the line between rap and real-life confessions. It quickly became one of the most controversial tracks of the year. Lil Jeff and Vert had been teasing its release for weeks, and when it finally dropped, it was exactly what everyone expected: raw energy, violence, and a complete lack of remorse. But what really shocked listeners was Jeff's bold claim that he had taken 7 lives. He rapped about it with such confidence and detail that people were left questioning whether he was boasting or making a confession. To Jeff, it was just another flex. His lyrics were so precise and unapologetic that it left fans wondering if he was revealing real crimes through his music. It wasn't just disrespect, it was a full-blown celebration of death. And that wasn't the only thing that had people talking. In one verse, he claimed that his crew had fired so many shots on Rads Avenue that their rivals had been forced to shut down their drug operations. If what he said was true, it wasn't just about bodies piling up, it was about power and control over the streets. Another line took aim at former friends who had now become enemies. Jeff didn't hold back, making it clear that loyalty meant nothing in his world. He called out those who had once been close to him but had switched sides, making sure they knew there was no forgiveness in the game he played. His words weren't just music, they were a declaration of war. The song sparked outrage, drawing attention from law enforcement and the media. Some called it a dangerous influence on the youth, while others argued that it was simply a reflection of reality. But for those who lived in the same streets Jeff rapped about, there was no doubt. His words were more than just lyrics. They were warnings, threats, and statements of dominance. As the controversy grew, so did Jeff's infamy. He thrived off the attention, knowing that fear and respect often went hand in hand. Whether people loved or hated him, they were all listening. And in his world, that was all that mattered. Was about territory. His side was occupying whole streets and not simply deleting names, the song said. Cars performing at parties and taking over drill forums caused quick blasting, which some said Jeff was exaggerating. Others took his word for it, but one thing was for sure: he was fearless. His reputation for self-snitching was already building, and he went one step further. Was he really keeping score? Or was it just talk? That issue wasn't left unanswered for long, because his subsequent action demonstrated that Jeff's story regarding murder was factual. Jeff made sure that Money's death was fully paid for in March 2023, since it created a wound that could only be healed by blood. Real Nam Lil Poo Jeff had already determined that Wu wasn't going to summer and that this wasn't a careless hit, but Pierre Boozer Jr. had been acting as like nothing had changed. He still went out in familiar locations, joked with his people, and pretended that his name wasn't being mentioned in the streets. Jeff wasn't there. Instead, he played the long game. Days before the hit, he planted the trap through mutual connections. Word got out that a certain block was safe again, and Pooh took the bait. As expected, Pooh pulled into his home's driveway, the same spot he went to every night. He got out of his car and nodded at someone he knew. The night was quiet, and the distant hum of the city was audible in the background, but it didn't seem normal until it wasn't. The night air was still in the background when there was a flicker of the lot lights, a slight glitch that was hardly perceptible, but in that brief moment of distraction, a shadow moved. The first shot hit Lil Pooh's leg, causing him to collapse and grab his knee as he tried to crawl toward his house, but he never made it. More shots came quickly and relentlessly after that, and the final one struck him in the back of the head, leaving him face down on the pavement. A car engine roared, tires screeched, and the shooter vanished. When the cops arrived, witnesses remained still. Had seen anything, but the streets were aware of it. A year later, Jeff clarified the message by commenting on a post about Pooh on Instagram, stating that insulting Zed Money has repercussions. Then, the song was released. A few days before to his own demise, Jeff wrote about how he had been hidden in the grass, ready to attack, and how Pooh had been apprehended. However, Jeff wasn't the kind to take it easy after Pooh, and by 2022, the bullets were flying from a moving automobile. Jeff's opponents were more numerous than he could count, and when tensions reached a breaking point, he dealt with it as usual by resolving the issue. In March of that year, the streets were ablaze with rumors of a drive-by. The target, Roger Lewis, also known as Black, was a 33-year-old local legend who was respected. That evening, Black was deep in conversation outside his home, completely unaware of the slow-moving car creeping up the street. The people inside were watching him intently, waiting for the right moment, and the driver maintained a steady pace while the backseat window cracked open. A few people ducked into their homes, while others peeked out already knowing there was nothing they could do. A month later, authorities arrested Trayvon Dix in connection with the shooting, but despite the arrest, there was still a lot of whispers in the streets. Black tried to turn, but it was too late, and the bullets tore through him, dropping his body near the sidewalk. The car sped off, disappearing into the night before anyone could get a good look. A few weeks later, Jeff released a song that left people wondering about everything. One line in particular stood out. Some old heads think they run things until they get caught standing outside at the wrong time. A drive-by was one thing, but Jeff had a habit of outdoing himself, and when two bodies dropped on the same night, the message was clear: this wasn't Jeff's intention. It was thought that Jeff had ordered the hit because tension between his crew and Black's people had been rising, and this felt like a calculated move to settle the score. Domination was more than simply a fight. Despite his involvement in several acts of street violence, November 1, 2023, stands out as one of Lil Jeff's most brutal episodes. That night, two individuals were killed in what many thought was a planned execution. It was meant to be just another night. Unaware that they were being observed, Lil Juice and D-Money were sitting in a parked vehicle, either conversing or looking through their phones, when a black SUV circled the block once again. The murderers were waiting for the ideal opportunity, and they made no quick movements or rushes. A door swung open a few feet away, and before the victims could react, the gunman emerged and unleashed a barrage of bullets. Juice and D-Money never had a chance, but the attack lasted only a few seconds, but the message was irrevocable by the time the shooters got back into the SUV and drove away. Both victims were critically injured, and paramedics rushed them to the University of Chicago Medical Center, but neither survived when the police arrived. Shell casings littered the pavement, but the streets were silent as usual. No suspects are seen. In March 2024, Lil Jeff posted a mysterious Instagram story with a few emojis. To the outside world, the message meant nothing, but to those who understood, one name stood out as a clear reference to D-Money's murder. Most people would lay low after planning a double homicide. However, the case remained open, and Jeff was never charged. By the beginning of 2024, Jeff's name was already being mentioned in relation to many street homicides, but when he fell, the discussion shifted in February. This wasn't simply another exercise. The words caused listeners to stop, even though the music was dark and the delivery was forceful. The anthem, which was full of threats and flexes, seemed like a confession. The details were too specific, but one terrifying line about a victim gasping for air as he took his last breath immediately linked to the actual murders of Monty and Lil Rob. Monty had been left struggling to breathe on the sidewalk, and Lil Rob's last moments were strikingly similar to what Jeff had described. Precise in a matter of hours, the internet was on fire. Every bar was broken down in Reddit posts that matched the lyrics to actual murder locations. Discussion boards discussed whether Jeff was only narrating a tale or whether this was real-time self-snitching. Jeff had previously been accused of rapping about actual murders, but this time he went one step further and described the victims' deaths, their last words, and his feelings as he watched it all happen. While boasting about bodies in a song is one thing, saying it live is quite another. Lil Jeff's way of handling business was cold and calculated. If he had a problem with someone, he wouldn't hesitate to act. One of his most ruthless moves was when he shot a rival in the stomach in broad daylight, making sure everyone knew he wasn't playing around. His philosophy was simple: strike first, be brutal. He didn't believe in giving second chances. If you crossed him, you wouldn't live to regret it. He never wore a mask, never showed fear. Every move he made was a warning to the streets. If you got on his bad side, there was no escape. His presence alone was enough to send a message. He had built a name for himself as one of the most feared figures around, and he thrived on that reputation. On May 13, 2021, death was closer than anyone realized. The streets of Chicago were as busy as ever. Cars moved up and down the roads, people filled the sidewalks, and businesses carried on with their daily operations. It was just another normal day, for most people. But for Jeff Gutter, the reality was different. Ronnie L. Sis. Drunk Jr. moved through the city as if he had nothing to worry about, as if enemies didn't exist. He acted too comfortable, unaware that danger was lurking nearby. What he didn't know was that Jeff Gutter had connected him to a murder from the month before. Whether the accusation was true or not didn't matter. What mattered was that Jeff believed it, and in his world, that was all the justification he needed. As the day went on, Jeff's mind was set. He wasn't the type to let things slide. On May 13, 2024, Thousands of people watched to see what Lil Jeff would say. Then, he sat calmly in front of the camera, flipping through a thick stack of cash, the diamonds on his Rolex catching the light with every movement. The comment section moved so quickly that it was impossible to read at first. It was the typical money talk, flexing and street stories, but then the energy changed, and Jeff leaned back, grinned, and revealed a. Some followers pumped him up, while others were astonished by his speech that sent shockwaves across the live chat. Whether they saw it live or received the recording, his foes heard the message clearly while sitting next to him. The Q50, if anybody believed Jeff was exaggerating, hearing Q50 cosign made it seem indisputable. A close colleague contributed his own statistics to make the confession much more difficult to reject. Within minutes, Jeff smiled and disbursed his money, utterly unconcerned by his recent admission. There were clips everywhere. It was one thing to move in silence, but going live and saying it aloud was something else entirely. If Jeff's next move wasn't reckless enough, people were shaking their heads. Reddit threads, drill forums, and even law enforcement circles debated whether he was sincere or just trying to get attention. However, those who knew the streets felt that every word this moment put an even greater price on his head and made him a bigger target for the police. In early February 2024, Lil Jeff shared something on Instagram that had the community talking. He called it his murdering school, and the admittance criteria was at least 2 corpses. He wasn't just about taking lives, he wanted others to do the same. Lil Jeff began by criticizing his rivals, accusing them of focusing on innocent people rather than conducting legitimate street business. This was a direct jab at those who spoke in his name, but what really got the city talking was the image that accompanied it, which everyone understood to be what each teardrop represented. In order to clarify the situation, Jeff meticulously arranged a number of emojis in the description to correspond with 10 victims. Some people thought that 2 of them were for Lil Rob and Monty, victims from previous street wars. Although that wasn't a confession, it wasn't necessary. Jeff was expert at expressing everything without saying too much. His colleague Q50 didn't waste any time uploading his own update, which included 8 corpses. If anybody was unsure, hearing 250 cosign just made it more eerie, but Jeff wasn't finished. His subsequent action caused the whole internet to analyze every word he said. Instead of making a direct statement, Lil Jeff posted something in April 2024 that shocked the streets. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than a few lyrics from an unreleased King Von song, but what followed made it much darker. One emoji in particular, a woman hat, made it easy for fans to associate it with D. Many people in the city thought that Money, a well-known name, was a coded method of taking credit for his homicidal silent mockery. Amidst some reflection despite the criticism, Jeff never removed the post, never clarified its meaning, and never addressed the rumors. Instead, he allowed people to argue, adding to the mystery and keeping his name in every conversation. No one could verify whether the emojis actually represented lives lost, but one thing was certain: Jeff wanted people to keep guessing. Others called Jeff's taunting of his enemies self-snitching, something he had already been accused of several times. The first picture featured 2 pricey watches on his wrist. The brands were unmistakable luxury pieces that only a select few in the city could afford, but this wasn't about flaunting wealth. Word quickly spread that they had been stolen from 6,300 Bartow by a known rival Jeff. Jeff didn't just take them. He posted them for the world to see, making sure Bartow and his crew felt the impact. This time, he turned it into his battlefield, but it wasn't a song, a mysterious caption, or a reckless live stream. Contempt, whether it was a direct confession or just another way to feed his own legend, the message was clear: something violent had happened. For those who were paying attention, this wasn't a random incident. Months earlier, Jeff had been robbed by BK members, an incident that quickly went viral online. Some saw this as his way of exacting revenge, telling them that he had taken something back if there was ever a moment that showed Lil Jeff had no boundaries in his life. He had established a reputation for being. In May 2024, he went one step further in an interview that had many wondering if he had lost all control. He was recklessly boasting about corpses, mocking his operations, and displaying no fear of the repercussions. Jeff felt at ease as Rose sat across from DJ U, a famous interviewer in the drill scene. At first, it was all business as usual, with thousands of people tuning in to hear what he had to say about his music, the streets, and his expanding impact. Even DJ U, who had seen his fair share of strange interviews, was taken aback when Jeff dug into his pocket halfway through answering a question, took out a broken-up Perrette, and smelled it on camera. As if he were acting out the scene in real time, Jeff leaned back and laughed while Q50, who was sitting next to him, laughed as well, hyping up the moment. Jeff then went one step further and compared himself to Tony Montana from Scarface, mumbling about his body count and laughing about the people who had fallen. The more he talked, the more it became. Evident social media had always been Lil Jeff's playground, but in early 2024 he turned it into his battlefield. This time, it wasn't a song, a mysterious message, or a careless live stream. Instead, it was photographs that shouted louder than words. He wasn't just talking carelessly, either.